to make some picture frames. So if you have any amount of power tools and call yourself a woodworker, at some point in time, somebody is going to ask you to make them a frame for a picture. And so I'm putting the finishing touches right now on two frames. This is a shadow box, and this is more of a normal frame, but it does have a nice little bead detail on the side here, which gives a nice accent. These are pretty simple to build. Just requires a few tools. The bead detail, for example, on this one is perfectly, it's not mandatory, so you can skip that part. But let's go back in time and let me show you how I put together these two frames and how I built them, so that if you want to build your own, then at least you got a model to follow. Stay tuned. I made both frames using 8-foot long 6x1 pine boards, which actually it's 5.5 inches wide by 3/4 inches thick. I cut those boards down to 2.5 inch wide stock. To get things started, I jointed one side and then ripped the boards on the table saw. To make shadow boxes, you need to make 3 cuts using the table saw. The first 2 cuts will cut a rabbet where the glass, the artwork, and a hard backing will eventually sit in. The third is a taper that accentuates the shadow box effect. You will see that my board sometimes jumps off the blade. If I had a mulligan here, I would cut the board up to rough length before cutting the rabbet. My approach left some waste. That was easily fixed. All I did is I used the sharp chisel to clean up the waste. And here is the third cut. I tilted the saw to 10 degrees and used an additional push block to keep the stock tightly against the saw blade. Again though, this cut would have been easier with shorter stock. Now is the time to cut the stock to length. For the shadow box, there are 2 long sides and 2 short ones. In order to make sure I would have exact same length for both the long short sides, I started by cutting one of the sides a bit long and comparing it with the artwork, slowly nibbling the length until it matched. Then I would set the stop block on the miter saw to reproduce the exact length for the opposite side. Use a cinch. Alright, so I've done a quick dry assembly for a couple of reasons. One is to validate that my angles were cut properly, and using my square, which is right here in the corner, I confirmed all 4 corners look really good. Second thing I wanted to confirm was that the picture would actually fit inside of the frame, and it does quite nicely, so that's good. And the third thing was to figure out how I'm going to glue this up. And I've got my strap clamp that's set up here. It's adjusted for size, so I'm at that point right now where I'm ready to put some glue on this and let it sit for a while so that it cures. Coming together quite nicely. You remember that mulligan I wanted before? Well, I'm taking it now. For the beaded frame, I started by cutting the 4 sides to rough length. Now in this case, the frame is going to be a square, so all 4 sides are of equal length. There are also 3 cuts that need to be made on the table saw for this type of frame. 2 that will cut a rabbet with the glass, the artwork and hard backing will eventually sit in, and the one that you're seeing right now to add a tapered effect. If I had another mulligan, I would actually start by cutting the bead using my router table before making this cut. More on that soon. Notice that it's a lot easier to hold down the stock against the saw blade because of the relative short length of the stock. It's a lot easier to manipulate. By the way, I'm using digital readout tools to confirm the angle and height of my saw blade. If you don't have these accessories, I highly recommend you get them. The precision and ease of use of these tools is well worth it. Here I'm cutting the rabbet in 2 cuts. I recommend another thing here. So draw out the outline of your frame in order to figure out where you need to make these cuts, the depth, etc. It's a lot easier to figure out your cuts that way. Time now for the beaded detail. I'm using my router table and a couple of feather boards to get a nice clean bead. Remember that second mulligan? I wish I had started here instead of cutting the taper. The stock was a bit unbalanced, but I ended up with good results by holding the stock very carefully. I continued this project on the next day. I started by cutting the miters on my miter saw. Since all 4 sides will be exactly the same length, I started by cutting 1 miter on each of the boards. I then used the same technique that I used with the shadow box. That is, cut one of the sides slightly long, compare the length to the artwork, nibble away the waste until I get a perfect match. Then adjust the stop block on the miter saw and cut the remaining 3 sides to final length. Alright, so here's the dry assembly on the second frame. You'll notice that I'm using 2 types of clamps. I'm using the band clamp, or the strap clamp, whatever you want to call it, around the edges. And I've got really good pressure on all 4 corners. And what's important here, let me just zoom in here, is that you align the beads and the cut so that they are very symmetrical. Now, there's a bit of an opening there. I'm going to see if I can fix that with glue and just make sure that that's a little bit not as pronounced. And the second thing I'm using is these simple hand clamps just to keep the level on this joint. It's pretty easy, pretty simple to do this. So next step is to put some glue, clamp it up for good, and let it sit there and let it cure for, let's say, half an hour or so. To address the small gaps in my miters, I used plastic wood as a filler. Alright, so I let the wood filler cure overnight and I just sanded one of the corners. That's what it looks like. So there's really no imperfections anymore. This is another corner that I've yet to touch. So you see like the wood filler is dried up. It is very visible, so with about 2 or 3 minutes worth of work, it's going to look like this. The frames are now ready for a finish. I used black stain on the shadow box and Canadian maple on the beaded frame. Both stains are made by Saman. I applied 2 coats of stain and 3 coats of a semi-gloss finish. If you have never used stain, it's important that the stain sit for a few minutes and then wipe off the excess with a dry cloth. Time now to cut backing to size. I'm using a 1/8 inch thick solid board for my backing. It's thin, it's light, but it's also very strong. I'm also using 1/8 inch thick plexiglass. Cutting this on the table saw is a bit of an experience. I used masking tape along the cut line to minimize tear out. The plexiglass has a tendency to jump while being cut, so you need to maintain a firm grip throughout. Final assembly. Yay! There's a protective film on the plexiglass that is easily removed. I then used Windex to clean up the inside face of the glass, since I won't be able to get to it after. The glass goes in first, then the artwork, and then the backing. To secure everything in place, I used fasteners that you can find at any hardware store. They're kind of star-shaped and can be pushed in place using a plastering knife. They're inexpensive, easy to set, and work like a charm. And if ever you need to change the artwork, they're also easy to remove. If you go to any big box store, you're going to find these picture hanging kits. It's got a bunch of hardware, various types of hardware that you can use. In this case, I'm going to use this kind of teeth-like teeth-like hanging device with, it's got 2 small nails. I'll find the middle, put it in. This picture frame will be done. Well, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you have not done so. Hit that like button. Leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. And see you soon, folks.